Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be both a sequel and a prequel of a previous lesson from the 7th chapter in the books of Acts. The material we already covered is the first 19 verses and also verses 45 through 60. We're going to cover the range in between. This is the section in Stephen's sermon, which pertains to Moses, and we meet Stephen in the 6th chapter. He is the originally named one of the 7 original deacons in the primitive apostolic church. He was a man of faith and power who performed signs and wonders, and he spoke through the power of the Spirit, and a group of antagonists gathered against him, but he spoke with an irresistible, they could not resist the Spirit speaking through him, so they can't beat him in open debate. They resort to a whispering campaign. They accuse him of declaring war on the temple, the Torah, and the institutes of Moses, and he addresses the temple in the range which comes after the range we're going to cover today. But here he really goes back. So he begins his speech. He's forced to give account to his witness and before the Sanhedrin, and the face of an angel exudes around him. And he goes back all the way to the basics, beginning with Abraham. Stephen is a scriptorian. If ever there was a workman who need not be ashamed for his ability to correctly divide the word of truth, Stephen might have been that man. He says in the 6th verse, "And Elohim spoke in this way, that his seeds would be sojourning in a foreign land, and that they would be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. This quotation occurs in Genesis 15:13. Now there are two things we read. We read of a daytime vision in the 15th chapter of Genesis, and we also read a nighttime vision when he is made privy to the fact that his descendants will be enslaved in another nation for 400 years. The number is 430 to be exact, according to Exodus 12:40. But Stephen repeats the rounded number because that is his reference point. And, he assures that the nation who did this to his people will be judged, and they were, in the form of the plagues and ultimately with the extinction of the Egyptian empire. Then he speaks of the covenant of circumcision, and then he speaks of how providence directed their ancestors to the land of Egypt. And the ancestors, becoming jealous, sold Joseph into Egypt, but Elohim was with him and delivered him out of all afflictions, and gave him favor and wisdom before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he appointed him governor over Egypt and all his house." So the brothers of Joseph were envious at that he was his father's favorite, his personal favorite, and that he signalized his favoritism in the form of an expensive coat, which provoked and he was also boastful and immature, and he had dreams which would come to pass of the 12 stars, him being his father, bowing down before him. And they they were murderously motivated. They tried to kill him, but then the intervention of Reuben and Judah prevented them, and they ended up selling him to Ishmaelite traders who carried him to Egypt. And from the prison to all the way to the palace, Yahweh was with him the entire time. His hand of providence had arranged it to be here so that Joseph could bring the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise of blessing the other nations through his services. This is the famine of food. So Egypt is a breadbasket. They have a pretty sure source of irrigation in the Nile, and it was to here that Abraham retreated when he was visited by famine. And the similar situation goes again. Joseph interprets the meaning of the Pharaoh's troubling dream, which is 7 years of agricultural abundance followed by 7 years of famine. So he arranges a plan to store in silos the excess grain and revenue, and all the nations around them, they are stricken with famine and they gravitate. So Jacob hears word and rumor that there is food in Egypt. He sends his sons, and then while there, Joseph sort of toys with them because he has the power, and but then he eventually reveals himself. They reconciled, and they begin as a nation of a family of 75 people. Jacob did have 12 sons within a nation, and there they grew into a nation, and they kept procreating. And then verse 17, "But as the time of the promise drew near, which Elohim had sworn in Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt." So the time of promise was the reference to their 400-year slave experience. And it all unfolded, because they were so procreatively prolific. Abraham had the promise in the stars in the sky and the dust on the ground, and in his new name, Abraham, he was once Abram, translates as father of many nations. And so this they grew to a nation within a nation, and then what happened is the new Egyptian empire, the 18th dynasty, witnessed a restoration of native rule and the accompanying xenophobia which accompanied their imperial drive, until another king who arose who did not know Joseph. This is a reference to Exodus 1:8. This king may have been Amhos the first, the founder of the 18th dynasty. Having dealt treacherously with our race, this one mistreated our fathers, making them expose their children so that they should not live. So his genocidal edict was that even when they were captured and enslaved, they multiplied too quickly. There were too many of them. So he issued an order that the newborn male children's be killed, drowned in the Nile, and this is where Providence once again arranges for their deliverer. But the pattern that is established in Joseph, which repeats in Moses and repeats to their present day, it indicates a rejection. He was chosen, but he was rejected to the people that he was brought to, and this ultimately culminates in what prophet have you not stoned or persecuted? Was there ever a prophet your ancestor did not persecute? They killed those who were before announced the righteous one, before he knew how been betrayers. We're going to open with the 20th verse, 7th chapter of Acts lesson itself. At that time Moses was born, and he was well-pleasing to Elohim, and he was reared 3 months in the house of his father. So his parents, whose names they're anonymous in the 2nd chapter of Exodus, but they're revealed in the 6th chapter. But Moses' name is Egyptian in origin. It translates as to give birth, and this was reflected in two monarchs of at least two of their names in the 18th dynasty, Thutmose and Amhos. So their names reflect the same root, but so he was born a Hebrew but raised Egyptian, and because they conceived this plot. But when he was exposed, the daughter of Pharaoh took him up and reared him as her own son. So after the 3-month period, they had illegally smuggled this baby to not be drowned in the Nile, and they sent him adrift on a basket, an ark. We read that term in reference to Noah's ark, the basket that he was sent on, and he drifts down the river, and who should he notice but the Pharaoh's daughter herself, who they arrange an interesting legal fiction whereby the mother is allowed to nurse Moses, and then when he comes of age, he is adopted as the Pharaoh's own. So he's raised in royalty, born to a race of enslaved people, but he lives the palace life. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and works. So this much is implied in the 2nd chapter. We don't read of his education, but as he would have been raised in royalty, he would have been exposed to all the advancements in civilization and knowledge. And the Egyptians they had a rich history and contribution to knowledge and wisdom. And he was also mighty in words and works. So whether by measure of words, he is the most prolific prophet. He authored the Pentateuch, and the 5 books, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And works, he performed miracles the likes of which had never been seen and would never be seen again, from the 10 plagues to the parting of the Red Sea, perhaps the most dramatic miracle in the Old and New Testament. But he is the standard and the preeminent figure of Jewish religion, whether measured by words or works. And Stephen was also mighty in words and works. He did perform signs and wonders, but Stephen's career is kind of like a comet. It comes brightly, but it crashes suddenly. So after he's stoned in the passage by the end of the chapter to death for the words. And when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit the brothers, the children of Israel. So Moses' life spans 120 years and can be conveniently categorized into 3 40-year periods, the first 40 years of which he spent raised in royalty. He would have had all the privileges and none of the responsibilities of being a prince. all the education, all the leisure, all the he would have been assigned certain administrative tasks. You can imagine as the adopted son of the princess. But he took it upon himself to visit. He had the revelation at one point that he was a Hebrew. And once he came to an awareness that this came when he was 40 years old. He identified with his brothers who were in toil and bondage, the life of which he had no experiential knowledge in, but he took it upon himself to visit his people and identify with them. And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended and revenged him who was oppressed, smiting the Egyptian. So the Egyptian oppressor was an Egyptian taskmaster, and he was integral cog in the slave system. The obedience of slave was enforced by physical violence and force, and so Moses sees this Hebrew slave being beaten and oppressed excessively, perhaps, by an Egyptian taskmaster, and he doesn't like it, so he actually ends up killing him. It's technically manslaughter, but the rumor that's what Providence uses to send him to the next 40-year period of his life as a shepherd. And he thought that his brothers would have understood that Elohim would give deliverance to them by his hand, but they did not understand. So once more, the pattern of rejection, and he's approved, he's well-pleasing to Elohim. We read that in the 20th verse, and he is the favored one and the chosen one to give the chosen people their deliverance and their redemption. But they do not understand him. They underestimate him. And one of their rebukes becomes a fulfilled prophecy 40 years hence. So remember those 40-year marks. And the next day he appeared to two of them as they had been fighting and urged them to peace, saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you wrong one another?" So this is just a fight between slaves. It's not an oppressive force. It's just, perhaps one Hebrew slave bullying or fighting or striking another. And Moses sees that and he intervenes. Much to his own consternation, his authority is immediately and violently and vehemently rejected. But what cause for quarrel would slaves have when they are being oppressed? That doesn't add up or make sense to him either. But he who was wronging his neighbor pushed him away, saying, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us?" So the term judge in the book of Judges is an authority and a ruler. So that term, before the monarchical period, Israel was ruled by a series of judges. These were the leaders, the military leaders, and the ones to whom had the power of judgment. So they weren't strictly judicial. They were also executive and military. But this fulfillment would become that he who was born in royalty would be born to rule, but just not the people who didn't really belong to him, and he didn't belong to them. Providence arranged for him to have the upbringing he had, because he had the familiarity with the protocol of the court to approach Pharaoh to petition him for his people. That is something no other Hebrew could do. "Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" So the secret's out. The beans have been spilled. They know what he doesn't want them to know, that he has blood on his hands. And he's afraid that they can inform on him on the Egyptians. And in the second chapter of Exodus, we read that the Egyptian king was determined to kill him in response. But so he fled away to the land of Midian, where he lived as a shepherd for the next 40 years. And at this saying, Moses fled and became a sojourner in the land of Midian, where he fathered 2 sons. So the next 40 years of his life were spent as a pastor, a shepherd, and just like David was raised from the sheep pen to the throne, so too was Moses raised from a sheep pen to royalty. Now he had a comfortable, leisurely life, but he wasn't acquainted with the hardship. He didn't have the dirt. He didn't have the real world experience of fending for oneself and surviving, taking a trade to survive. Every want, need, and desire would have been provided for him in the Egyptian court. This is a whole new way of living. And his identity crisis was one of being too Hebrew for the Egyptians and too Egyptians for the Hebrews. So he kind of fit right in with the Midianites. These were descendants of Abraham, and his stepfather Jethro was a priest, And they're because they were of Abrahamic descent, the possibility exists that they were not polluted by the pagan corruption which would eventually overwhelm the Midianite people. But Moses also fathered 2 sons, and this was not the only woman he married. He also married a Cushite woman, which provides his siblings the pretext to revolt against him. So the rebellion is even in Moses' own family. It's not limited to the Hebrew people alone. We can turn to Numbers 12 for that. And after 40 years were completed, an angel of Yahweh appeared to him in a flame and a fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is a mountain that is some 7,400 feet tall, so somewhere around this range. It was in the desert of Mount Zion, so it might have been on a mountain slope. We don't know where it was on the mountain, but this was 40 years. He would have been 80 years old. 40 years old when he fled from Egypt, and then when he's been shepherding and living his life for another 40 years, and then an angel appears to him in the flame of the fire. This is consistent with Exodus 3:2, and then the angelic mediator communicates the sacred name of Yahweh, and the bush is consumed, is burning but not consumed in a miraculous theophanic manifestation. And this all took place on the same or near the same vicinity as the issuing of the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, and the stones of the covenant. And Moses, seeing it, marveled at the sight, and coming near to look, the voice of Yahweh came to him. So his sense of sight is engaged, and he's curious, and he's marveling at the sight. This is something the likes of which is not in the ordinary experience, certainly not an everyday encounter. And but then the sense of hearing is stimulated by the voice of Yahweh, who comes to him and tells him, saying, I am the Elohim of your fathers, the Elohim of Abraham, and the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob. And Moses trembled and did not have the courage to look. So fear is a human and natural and commonplace response to a theophanic manifestation. A theophany is a visible or tangible manifestation of divinity, and so he tells him that this is an affirmation of the doctrine of the resurrection, because he is the Elohim of the living. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are still living in his presence. The Savior uses this verse to refute the Sadducees who denied the resurrection when they conceived of a question to trap him. And we can read of that in the Synoptics. But Yahweh said to him, take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is sacred ground. So the ground was not sacred in itself. It became sacred because his sanctifying presence was there. He is sacred, so anything he touches becomes by connection sacred. So this land became sacred, and as such he demanded that he be approach him reverently and worshipfully by removing the sandals from his feet to approach the sacred one on the sacred ground. I have certainly seen the evil treatment of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their groaning, and I have come down to deliver them. And now come, let me send you to Egypt. So contrary to whatever the Hebrews were imagining, that they were praying to an empty, impotent God in the sky, he had heard their prayers, and enough had become enough. Their prayers had become frequent and fervent enough to compel him to action. So it did take the 400 years of oppression to finally compel them to the fervency and frequency of prayer, which would cause him to intervene. Of course, he all knew this, but the important thing here is that Moses was his chosen human vessel, his instrument. He was to be Elohim to Pharaoh, and Aaron was to be his prophet, because Moses struggled with speech. This Moses, whom they had refused, saying, who made you a ruler and judge? This one Elohim sent to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. So the same angelic mediator who was there at the revelation of the sacred name, we can read of this in Genesis, the 3rd chapter, also, was with him when he became the leader. He provided the vital leadership function and role that he could uniquely provide in the Exodus generation. He was born to rule. He was born in royalty, accustomed to command and control, and knew how to organize and administrate, something that the slave wouldn't have been intimately acquainted with. So it was necessary that he not know the life of a slave in order to leave these enslaved people as newly liberated people in the promised land of milk and honey. The problem is that the slaves, they left the slave shacks, but the slave shackles stayed on them. They eventually, not far into their journey, they are already yearning for the comforts of slavery between the dietary items they had versus the unfavorable manna in the sky. So they were preferring the security of bondage to the challenges of freedom. So they remained slaves, and as such they suffered without entering into the promised land. This one led them out after he had done wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. So he led them out. He took them from the deserts of Egypt all the way to the promised land around the desert. They wandered in an area the equivalent of the size of the state of New Jersey for 40 years. Because of their waywardness and disobedience. But he was ahead of them all the time, and he performed the signs and wonders which accomplished their deliverance in Egypt. These were the 10 plagues, which were 10 demands to let his people go, and then he was issued the 10 commands at Sinai. But even before he got there, there was the Red Sea, the parting thereof, Exodus 13:14. This is the standard miracle in the Old Testament, when the Pharaoh's army, the Pharaoh who was hard-hearted and wasn't compelled to relent on his resolve to not let the people go, to keep the integral slave labor system which was necessary to the functioning and flourishing of his empire, he, when his firstborn was struck, then he finally said, "You can go." But then he had a change of heart because he remained hard-hearted. He chased them with chariots, and the Red Sea was parted so that the Hebrews on foot could get by just in time for the waves, the sea to revert and swallow the chariots whole. And miracles have been performed, throughout the wilderness. They are too numerous to here list, but just the manna falling from the sky was a miracle in itself. This is the Moses who said to the children of Israel, "Yahweh your Elohim shall rise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. Him you shall hear." This is a citation of Deuteronomy 18:15. And when Moses speaks of a prophet like me, now there was no prophet like him in the Old Testament standard. This much is communicated by Numbers 12, 6, and 8. And also Deuteronomy 34:10. He was the standard. His law, none of the prophecies, they were covenant enforcers. All the prophecies were based on the law. He was the standard prophet. He spoke to him as a man speaks to a friend, face to face, eye to eye. Whereas in others, he revealed himself through dreams and visions and prophecies. He had the intimate access, but he speaks of one who is greater than him to come, a prophet like me. Now there is no comparison between Yahshua and Moses. One was mortal, sinful, a sinner and and imperfect, and the other was eternal, sinless, and perfect. But the Hebrews, testament to their nature and habit, a recurring theme throughout their history, they had rejected the chosen ones who had been sent for their benefit. This is he who was in the assembly in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and said with our fathers who received the living words to give to us. So he's saying that Moses was the one. It's not a capital he. That's not Yahshua who was in the. Who was there. He had seen the angel. The angel had revealed itself in visible, tangible form and spoke to him on Mount Sinai. And this is a distinct scene from that which was already transcribed in Exodus 3. This is the Exodus 19 through 24, the issuing of the covenant, which comes at the same vicinity of location, the 7,400 foot tall mountain in the Sinai Peninsula, which is to the northeast of Egypt. unto whom our fathers would not become obedient, but thrust away, and in their hearts they turned back to Egypt. So the rebellion was the fact of life. It was their standard state of being throughout the wilderness wanderings and the Exodus journeys. There's the rebellion of Korah. There was the rebellion of murmuring. They succumbed to Balaam's enticements and allures. It just and the rebellion really began before he was even appointed the judge, because he was appointed to be the judge and the ruler before the foundation of the earth. But as much as the Hebrew slaves, the quarreling Hebrew slave who was beating up on his fellow Hebrew had rejected him, so too would the nation en masse. They would succumb, they would worship the golden idol. This is referenced in the 40th verse, saying to Aaron, make us mighty ones to go before us, for this Moses who led us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So while Moses is fasting for a 40-day period, this is the brink of life and death, he is up on the Mount Sinai. He is receiving a revelation of the heavenly model of the tabernacle. So Exodus 25 through 31 is this blissful interlude, but then it returns to earth in the 32nd chapter, which connects to the 24th chapter. Remember our range in Exodus, our frame of range. And they just became so impatient during that 40-day. He's going through the winger. They're getting restless. They're not moving. They cannot move without his direction. He is there for 40 days, and it didn't take them that long to forget the deity who had redeemed them and had accomplished their deliverance. And they sacrifices, and Aaron, his sin was he followed a multitude to do evil. He succumbed to peer pressure. He responded in cowardice. He did not take a stand as the high priest, and so he was somewhat impotent in the absence of his brother, as were the spiritually lethargic nation of Israel. They were not a nation yet. They were the people who would become the nation of Israel. And they made a calf in those days and brought an offering to the idol and were rejoicing in the works of their own hands. So after a 40-day fast, and he comes down from this mountain where he just receives this revelation, that's this majesty of divinity that's going to be for their benefit. He sees them engaging in revelry. They're singing and dancing and perhaps engaging in sexually promiscuous postures in public in worship service. That was the custom of idol worship. So they had substituted, they had exchanged the truth for a lie and worshiped that which was created rather than that which is created, Romans 1:24. And this Romans 1 also connects to the 42nd verse. So Elohim turned and gave them up to worship the host of the heavens, as it has been written in the book of the prophets. Did you bring sacrifice, feast, and offerings unto me during your 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? So 3 times in the book of Romans we read that Elohim gave them up. He surrenders the willfully wayward reprobate sinner to the consequences and the awful terrible consequences of persisting in their sin. So he surrenders them, he gives them up, and there comes a time in the sinner's life where Yahweh says has enough and says, okay, go your own way, do your own thing. You will reap the whirlwind. But then he proceeds to quote Amos, the 5th chapter, and there is a distinction which is adjusted to his audience in the 43rd verse. And you do not look up to the tent of Moloch and the star of the mighty one Chiron, images which you made to bow before them. Therefore I shall remove you beyond Babel. So in Amos's original version, it's not Babylon, but Damascus. He was writing to the northern kingdom of Israel, who would experience their exodus and their exile prematurely to those of Judah. But Stephen is addressing a Judean audience, so what was true for Israel is by connection true to Judah. So they... that Molech was the Canaanite fertility deity to whom child sacrifices were child sacrifices were offered, and Calon was a solar deity or a celestial deity connected with star worship that was related to the planet Jupiter. And for forsaking the truth and exchanging the truth for a lie, they invited their just consequence in their exile to Babylon, where their idolatrous inclinations were more or less permanently purged. The tent of the witness was with our fathers in the wilderness as he appointed, instructing Moses to make it according to the pattern that he had seen. So the tent of witness is the tabernacle. This was the pre-temple site and center and location of the divine presence. It had a sacred of sacreds, the whole lineup, the whole system. It was just in a tent. It wasn't in a building yet. They were mobile people on the wandering in the desert. But this earthly construction was according to a heavenly design. That's where Moses was in Exodus chapters 25 through 31, and then the revelry of the golden calf worship is Exodus 32, but that's all the time we have for today. After this, he clarifies some of the misconceptions about his attack on the temples. He may have said that Yahshua was greater than the temple, and this is consistent with Matthew 12:6, but he addresses that charge. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.